Chapter 41 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 41, containing some romantic passages between Mrs. Nickleby and the gentleman in the small clothes next door. Ever since her last momentous conversation with her son, Mrs. Nickleby had begun to display unusual care in the adornment of her person, gradually superadding to those staid and matronly habiliments which had up to that time formed her ordinary attire, a variety of embellishments and decorations, slight perhaps in themselves, but, taken together and considered with reference to the subject of her disclosure, of no mean importance. Even her black dress assumed something of a deadly lively air from the jaunty style in which it was worn, and, eked out as its lingering attractions were, by a prudent disposal here and there of certain juvenile ornaments of little or no value, which had, for that reason alone, escaped the general wreck, and been permitted to slumber peacefully in odd corners of old drawers and boxes where daylight seldom shone, her mourning garments assumed quite a new character. From being the outward tokens of respect and sorrow for the dead, they became converted into signals of very slaughterous and killing designs upon the living. Mrs. Nickleby might have been stimulated to this proceeding by a lofty sense of duty and impulses of unquestionable excellence. She might by this time have become impressed with the sinfulness of long indulgence in unavailing woe, or the necessity of setting a proper example of neatness and decorum to her blooming daughter. Considerations of duty and responsibility apart, the change might have taken its rise in feelings of the purest and most disinterested charity. The gentleman next door had been vilified by Nicholas, rudely stigmatized as a dotard and an idiot, and for these attacks upon his understanding Mrs. Nickleby was in some sort accountable. She might have felt that it was the act of a good Christian to show by all means in her power that the abused gentleman was neither the one nor the other. And what better means could she adopt towards so virtuous and laudable an end than proving to all men in her own person that his passion was the most rational and reasonable in the world, and just the very result of all others which discreet and thinking persons might have foreseen, from her incautiously displaying her matured charms, without reserve, under the very eye, as it were, of an ardent and too susceptible man. "Ah," said Mrs. Nickleby, gravely shaking her head, "if Nicholas knew what his poor dear papa suffered before we were engaged, when I used to hate him, he would have a little more feeling. Shall I ever forget the morning I looked scornfully at him when he offered to carry my parasol, or that night when I frowned at him? It was a mercy he didn't emigrate. It very nearly drove him to it." Whether the deceased might not have been better off if he had emigrated in his bachelor days was a question which his relict did not stop to consider, for Kate entered the room with her work-box in this stage of her reflections, and a much slighter interruption, or no interruption at all, would have diverted Mrs. Nickleby's thoughts into a new channel at any time. "Kate, my dear," said Mrs. Nickleby, "I don't know how it is, but a fine warm summer day like this, with the birds singing in every direction, always puts me in mind of roast pig with sage and onion sauce and made gravy." "That's a curious association of ideas, is it not, mamma?" "Upon my word, my dear, I don't know," replied Mrs. Nickleby. "Roast pig. Let me see. On the day 5 weeks after you were christened, we had a roast. No, that couldn't have been a pig either, because I recollect there were a pair of them to carve, and your poor papa and I could never have thought of sitting down to 2 pigs. There must have been partridges. Roast pig. I hardly think we ever could have had one, now I come to remember, for your papa could never bear the sight of them in the shops, and used to say that they always put him in mind of very little babies, only the pigs have much fairer complexions, and he had a horror of little babies too, because he couldn't very well afford any increase in his family, and had a natural dislike to the subject. It's very odd now, what could have put that in my head? I recollect dining once at Mrs. Bevan's in that broad street round the corner by the coachmaker's, where the tipsy man fell through the cellar flap of an empty house nearly a week before the quarter day, and wasn't found till the new tenant went in. And we had roast pig there. It must be that, I think, that reminds me of it, especially as there was a little bird in the room that would keep on singing all the time of dinner. At least not a little bird, for it was a parrot, and he didn't sing exactly, for he talked and swore dreadfully. But I think it must be that. Indeed, I'm sure it must. Shouldn't you say so, my dear?" "I should say there was not a doubt about it, mamma," returned Kate with a cheerful smile. "No, but do you think so, Kate?" said Mrs. Nickleby, with as much gravity as if it were a question of the most imminent and thrilling interest. "If you don't, say at once, you know, because it's just as well to be correct, particularly on a point of this kind, which is very curious and worth settling while one thinks about it." Kate laughingly replied that she was quite convinced, and as her mamma still appeared undetermined whether it was not absolutely essential that the subject should be renewed, proposed that they should take their work into the summer-house and enjoy the beauty of the afternoon. Mrs. Nickleby readily assented, and to the summer-house they repaired without further discussion. "Well, I will say," observed Mrs. Nickleby as she took her seat, "that there never was such a good creature as Smike. Upon my word, the pains he has taken in putting this little arbour to rights, and training the sweetest flowers about it, are beyond anything I could have. I wish he wouldn't put all the gravel on your side, Kate, my dear, though, and leave nothing but mould for me." "Dear mamma," returned Kate hastily, "take these seats, to oblige me, mamma." "No, indeed, my dear, I shall keep my own side," said Mrs. Nickleby. "Well, I declare!" Kate looked up inquiringly. "If it hasn't been," said Mrs. Nickleby, "and got, from somewhere or other, a couple of roots of those flowers that I said I was so fond of the other night, and asked you if you were not— No, that you said you were so fond of the other night, and asked me if I wasn't— Oh, it's the same thing. Now, upon my word, I take that as very kind and attentive indeed. I don't see," added Mrs. Nickleby, looking narrowly about her, "any of them on my side, but I suppose they grow best near the gravel. You may depend upon it they do, Kate, and that's the reason they are all near you, and he's put the gravel there because it's the sunny side. Upon my word, that's very clever now. I shouldn't have had half as much thought myself." "Mamma," said Kate, bending over her work so that her face was almost hidden, "before you were married—" "Dear me, Kate," interrupted Mrs. Nickleby, "what in the name of goodness graciousness makes you fly off to the time before I was married, when I'm talking to you about his thoughtfulness and attention to me? You don't seem to take the smallest interest in the garden." "Oh, mamma," said Kate, raising her face again, "you know I do." "Well then, my dear, why don't you praise the neatness and prettiness with which it's kept?" said Mrs. Nickleby. "How very odd you are, Kate." "I do praise it, mamma," answered Kate gently. "Poor fellow!" "I scarcely ever hear you, my dear," retorted Mrs. Nickleby. "That's all I've got to say." By this time the good lady had been a long while upon one topic, so she fell at once into her daughter's little trap, if trap it were, and inquired what she had been going to say. "About what, mamma?" said Kate, who had apparently quite forgotten her diversion. "Law, Kate, my dear," returned her mother, "why, you're asleep or stupid. About the time before I was married." "Oh, yes," said Kate, "I remember. I was going to ask mamma, before you were married, had you many suitors?" "Suitors, my dear!" cried Mrs. Nickleby, with a smile of wonderful complacency. "First and last, Kate, I must have had a dozen at least." "Mamma!" returned Kate in a tone of remonstrance. "I had indeed, my dear," said Mrs. Nickleby, "not including your poor papa, or a young gentleman who used to go at that time to the same dancing school, and who would send gold watches and bracelets to our house in gilt-edged paper, which was always returned, and who afterwards unfortunately went out to Botany Bay in a cadet ship, a convict ship, I mean, and escaped into a bush and killed sheep. I don't know how they got there, and was going to be hung, only accidentally choked himself, and the government pardoned him. Then there was young Lukin," said Mrs. Nickleby, beginning with her left thumb and checking off the names on her fingers. "Mowgli, Tipslark, Cabbery, Smithser." Having now reached her little finger, Mrs. Nickleby was carrying the account over to the other hand, when a loud which appeared to come from the very foundation of the garden wall, gave both herself and her daughter a violent start. "Mamma, what was that?" said Kate, in a low tone of voice. "Upon my word, my dear," returned Mrs. Nickleby, considerably startled, "unless it was the gentleman belonging to the next house, I don't know what it could possibly—" "Ahem!" cried the same voice, and that, not in the tone of an ordinary clearing of the throat, but in a kind of bellow, which woke up all the echoes in the neighbourhood, and was prolonged to an extent